Welcome to this presentation on William Wordsworth. He is the second of the major poets we've covered so far. However, he's technically the first British Romantic. He, along with Samuel Taylor Coleridge, really are responsible for beginning this entire movement. So consider this to be the second lecture in the British Romanticism series for this particular school year. So please have your notes open and get ready to go. So I wanted to start with some background information about William Wordsworth, just some things so that we can kind of put it all into perspective. We're talking about April 1770, so putting it all in perspective, this puts the highlight of his career right around 1810, maybe even earlier in the 1790s, in the early 19th century. So just some basic facts. We know that his parents died. He had four siblings, were left in the care of different relatives. Very standard for the day if parents died. Also, remember this idea of mortality and the age that people die relatively young. So this is not an unusual thing. We know that Wordsworth, as it says here in that second point, really focused on his love of nature, and most of what he does in his poetry and most of what we are going to cover in here focuses on that idea of nature, the sensuous nuance that he and Coleridge talk about in the lyrical ballads. You're going to hear that phrase a lot again in this presentation. So the theme of nature is incredibly important. While studying at Cambridge, Wordsworth spent a summer holiday on a walking tour in Switzerland and France. He became an enthusiast for the ideals of the French Revolution. That is freedom, liberty, those two particular concepts. We see that reflected in the themes of British Romanticism, especially if you look at the later British poets or the later British Romantics. That would be Keats, Shelley, and Byron. We're going to get to them as soon as we get through the first three. These walking tours are extraordinarily important for Wordsworth and Coleridge because it's a good place to look at where they get their inspiration. So I think these are some important background bits of information that are relevant to us as we move forward. A couple other or three other things that I think are even more important. None of the poetry of Wordsworth was published until 1793. 1797, he moved to Somerset to live near the poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who was an admirer of Wordsworth's work. Samuel Taylor Coleridge is most known for his epic poem, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. There's a few other that we're going to take a look at. This Lime Tree, My Bower is one. Christabel, we might cover. It's kind of a vampire poem. Just interesting ideas in there. We're going to see as we get there. And we know that Coleridge and Wordsworth collaborated on the lyrical ballads published in 1798. So 1798 really marks the genesis of British Romanticism. So this is putting us right in the thick of what's going on. So with this introduction of William Wordsworth, I mentioned again the lyrical ballads and the role these lyrical ballads had 1798 in really changing the face of British literature. So that's, again, a really, really important thing. If I ask you about any dates, I'm probably going to ask you about 1798 and the formation of the lyrical ballads because they mark the beginning of the Romantic unit in British literature. We know that the poems were generally greeted with hostility because they so challenged the norms of what we saw in metaphysical and carpe diem and really the sonnet. It breaks with the forms that we're very much used to. We know that Wordsworth is largely influenced, not totally, but he himself suffered some great tragedy, and as a result of those great tragedies, we see some of that melancholy. We see that sadness creeping into a lot of the poems. So again, that term sensuous nuance applies to Wordsworth. He and Coleridge really coined that term as they developed the lyrical ballads. So we can attribute a lot of the tragedy that Wordsworth went through in his life to his subject matter. So, for example, two of his children died, his brother was drowned, and his sister Dorothy had a mental breakdown. So we've got tremendous amounts of tragedy. Again, two of his children died. His brother was drowned at sea, and his sister Dorothy had a mental breakdown. So this completely crushes Wordsworth's psyche and has a significant impact on him. So this happens after the publication of the lyrical ballads and really has an impact. A bit redundant there. He continued to write poetry, but really the late stuff is not nearly as significant as what he produced early in his career with Coleridge. We're going to take a look at a few of those. I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud. I've got a nice little presentation later on here that's going to connect to those ideas. So you focus on that as we go. We know that in 1842 he was given a government pension and was named the Poet Laureate of England. The Poet Laureate is the title that the best poet in the land gets. I'd like to say I know who the Poet Laureate of the United States is. I don't know currently. I know that Maya Angelou held that title for a while. I know it changes throughout time. But I know that William Wordsworth was given the title of Poet Laureate of England, and he died April 23rd, 1850. I find this ironic because that is generally agreed upon as the same day, not the same year, but the same date that William Shakespeare died. So again, little sneaky tidbits that we get that I think are relevant in our overall presentation. So if Wordsworth is so specifically important to this movement, make sure that as we go through this week, you attend to his Elements of Poetry. Of course, a nice little redux here of the features of Romanticism certainly wouldn't hurt our presentation here with William Wordsworth. Perhaps you should transfer these ideas to your notes or, of course, tweak them because the language is a little bit different and provides some additional information. So, again, we have as a major characteristic of Romanticism the love of nature and how that influences and inspires each author to develop his ideas. So if I look at how Wordsworth specifically addresses these, and I know the print may be a little bit small for you, but alas, I'm sure we'll be okay. So emphasize the importance. I think that second point, that response to the Industrial Revolution, really is part of the thematic change that we're going to see in Wordsworth. Blake touched on it a little bit in his later poems, the experience ones. We're going to see this conflict that the Industrial Revolution in England has with Romanticism, fairly specifically as we go through these particular units. Major theme, that third point, lamented the shift in life from the peaceful countryside to the chaotic city. This is a significant change. Again, thematically, we saw it in American literature with the Transcendentalists and how the Romantics really began to lose hold on their emotion over logic as the Americans faced the American Civil War. For the British, it was industrialization. It was the ramping up of these new technologies and new ideas and how that conflicted with the rural agrarian lifestyle of living in the woods and living out on the farms and all of that. So That point number 4, believe that the Industrial Revolution transformed man's natural order. I think that's an excellent focus as a theme, something that could show up on a quiz. Believe that nature helped the urban man find his true identity. Absolutely. Wordsworth talks about uh, imagining being in Tintern Abbey, or a few miles above it actually, in the woods, where he was on a walking tour while he's standing in the city. When he talks about being lonely as a cloud, he imagines daffodils. And again, he's in the city as he's having this sort of revelation of how these ideas have an effect on him as a person. So again, I think those are important ideas for this love of nature. Continuing, here you have nationalism. How does the poet laureate and William Wordsworth have a profound effect on nationalism and how that nationalism grows and changes and reshapes what the British think about themselves? Again, think that's a tremendously significant idea that you will have the opportunity to develop as you go. Now, to further look at the notes on this, and see how I'm going kind of quickly through that, nationalism borrowed heavily from the folklore and popular local art. Again, if you are a Brit, you would look at the Carpe Diem poetry. You would look at the larger epics. For us, that could be something like Beowulf. That could be the Canterbury Tales. It could be the influence of Shakespeare on how all of these things worked out. But the major difference of British Romantic poetry of Wordsworth forward is that we shifted our focus from the wealthy, isolated, upper crust of wealthy landowners and those kinds of things. And this poetry dealt much, much more with the common man and how he interacted with his day-to-day life. Again, you've got a couple more points there. Language is exceedingly different. This ties us into the diction of the common man. The term we could use is the idea of the common vernacular. So here's 5 really good points on nationalism that I think, again, would provide you certain focus on moving forward and how these ideas work. So again, good start for the. Just to make sure I have your attention here, I'm going to give you a little bit of definition and context for what British Romantic poetry is. So you're going to see me reading, basically, but this is information I think is important. They are definitions for how Wordsworth ultimately sees Romantic poetry, hugely research-based. At the end of the PowerPoint I'm using for the other pieces of this lesson, I have a working bibliography or working works cited page so that I know where all of my resources come from, all my images, all of that. So here's some basic definition. So hold on, I'm putting it up here so that I can read it as we go. So Romantic literature, like other genres, shares similar literary elements that unify a certain style of poetry. William Wordsworth, a Romantic poet, used images of nature along with themes of idealism expressed with emotion in his poetry. So idealism expressed with emotion in his poetry. Used images of nature along with themes of idealism expressed with emotion in his poetry. Again, nature along with themes of individual. He uses nature, images of nature along with themes of idealism in his poetry. Elements used were very typical of other romantic themes and images. Without Wordsworth's use of them, his poetry would have been completely different. This is that connotative versus denotative that we've been talking about before. One element in Romantic literature that is very prevalent is images of nature and the speaker's poem, a few lines composed above Tintern Abbey. The actual title is Lines Composed a Few Miles Above Tintern Abbey, and there's a whole bunch of other commas and other phrases that come along with it as we go. But again, I still think that's important. But again, Lines Composed a Few Miles Above Tintern Abbey is a poem about a man who comes back to nature and realizes its profound beauty and praises its great effect on him. We're going to cover that probably end of the week as our big piece. We'll see what happens. But again, a few lines composed above Tintern Abbey is extraordinarily important. This is one poem that contains enormous amounts of images about nature. Throughout every stanza, the speaker describes the woods, the hills, the meadows, and the streams. He also speaks of his love of nature. I can give you some line numbers on that, but we'll get to it at the end of the week. So I think that's incredibly important as at least a context for nature and how Wordsworth uses it with a specific poem title. We also know that in Romantic literature, a major theme is idealism, or living a life better than the one that people are living now. So again, there's always this push for something better and what we might do with that more fulfilling life and what it might lead to if we were just pushing the borders of those images and those particular ideas. We also believe in our notes that the Romantic era can be characterized by the onset of complex socio-political occurrences that promoted radical shifts in ideology and social practice. It is during the Romantic era that Britain reaches a point of economic takeoff due to the enormous profits of the 18th century, slave trade, and Britain's imperial successes overseas. Their possession of the American colonies largely led to this. The idea that a huge amount of this is based on the slave trade is something that many poets directly go out and criticize. William Blake, particularly one of them. So again, there's a lot of interesting things there that I think are important. Britain's imperial success overseas and the financial ramifications of which provided the early structures of a capitalist nation. And by now, you should have figured out that many of our poets do not like capitalism. They don't like individuals getting more success than anybody else. They're much more of a share the wealth. We'd rather be socialist in our ramifications. In light of this and the classicizing conformist rationalism and Lockean empiricism of the Enlightenment era, that should have just rung a bell. That Lockean empiricism. I think that's a really significant overall idea for us. So we may want to keep that in mind as we go. Out of this idea of Lockean empiricism, and again, I'm looking at my notes, it says Britain's dominant ideological views became that of a utilitarian practice of a new merging middle class in capitalist society. Initially, these practices are articulated by England's move away from a primary agricultural society. Again, something that William Blake talked specifically about in his Songs of Experience, and what Wordsworth really starts hinting at in his lyrical ballads as we move into some of the darker ideas of what happens to nature as man gets too far away from it. So again, it says this new industrial Britain created a dominant ethos, and you know what ethos is. If not, write it down in your notes and then go look up what ethos is. Remember, it's a companion or brother, if you will, to pathos and logos, Greek terms, ethos. So this ethos, which understood nothing that could not be transformed into a commodity on the open markets. Significant changes in the way that people saw the world. Then it says, in light of this turmoil surrounding the French Revolution, Britain's ruling classes, fearing revolution, responded with brutal regressiveness, turning Britain into a police state. Thus, many of the Romantic writers sought to question the impetus and ramifications of a growing industrialized England by challenging the perceptions of its emergent mass media culture, the empirical rationale of the Enlightenment era, and Britain's utilitarian practices. Remember that utilitarianism is the greatest good for the greatest number of people. However, is that really a truth? I'm not exactly sure. So pay attention to these kinds of ideas. Again, many Romantic writers sought to question the impetus and ramifications of a growing industrialized England by challenging the perceptions of an emergent mass media culture, the empirical rationale of the Enlightenment era, and Britain's utilitarian practices, all of which regarded art and poetry, as an unprofitable ornamentation or a commodity built by hierarchy and decorum. God, that just sounds so much fun. Again, Britain's utilitarian practices, all of which regarded art as an unprofitable ornamentation or a commodity built upon hierarchy and decorum. This is what Wordsworth is most concerned about in his approach to writing the poetry that he does. They're noted by Wordsworth in the preface to the Lyrical Ballads, where he comments that the new ethos of industrial England threatened to blunt, not be blunt, but to blunt humanity's discriminatory powers, reducing mankind's critical perspective on society to a state of savage torpor, T-O-R-P-O-R. I believe that was a first semester vocabulary term for you. So again, Wordsworth was concerned that art as an idea, as an expression, so thus poetry and those kinds of things, was considered to be an unprofitable ornamentation or a commodity built upon hierarchy and decorum. In short, it was not poetry for the common man. So a whole bunch of philosophical, deeper kinds of things to think about for the poetry of William Wordsworth here. So I think this sets a good context. Now, I'm probably going to end this particular video here. I have some chunks that I can stick in here about the poem I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud. I may do that, but since it is 8:46 Monday night, the day we had off because of Martin Luther King Day in 2020, I have to make some decisions about how to do that. Now, ultimately, this video is going to be posted for Tuesday night, Wednesday morning. That would be the 21st and 22nd of January 2020. But in case I use this in the future, those dates ultimately aren't that relevant. So make sure you view this, you look it over, you take some notes to put everything that we're doing in class into context. So with that, take the quiz here that's going to show up momentarily, do some reflecting on your thoughts, and you should be in good shape.